Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here today. I must confess I feel a little bit inadequate because I write about trade, I broadcast about trade and supply chains, but I don't actually get my hands dirty, which I know a lot of you do in a lot of different sectors. So I'm really looking forward to learning a bit from you as well today. But I'm going to talk about the big picture when it comes to trade and tariffs and supply chains. And I'm going to ask what this new era means for the world and Britain. So as you heard, I am policy and analysis correspondent at BBC Verify. Before that, I was economics editor of Newsnight. Before that, I was economics editor of The Independent. So you can imagine how much trade is part of the world which I am covering at the moment for the BBC. I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes, so please do store up any questions you have and catch my eye at the end, because it'd be really good to have a little bit of back and forth between us rather than you just hearing me drone on for the full period. So, what is this new era that I referred to in the title? Well, I call it an era of exile economics, which is also the title, as you can see there, of my new book, Exile Economics: What Happens If Globalization Fails, available in all good bookshops, and if you want to pre-order the paperback, you can get it. If you go to Waterstone's website, you can get 25% off if you do it before this Friday. But here the sales pitch ends. Let's get into what I mean by exile economics. What does this title mean? Well, I was trying to find a way of describing some of the big trends that we've been seeing in recent years when it comes to trade, attitude to trade, and from governments and populations. And I use it to talk about three big movements in the globe. First of all, the top of there, you can see rejection of interdependence, the rejection and denial of the reality of economic and trade interdependence between nations economically. Second one there, you can see the downgrading of multilateral collaboration. Of course, that's on trade, but also other elements as well. I think that's a really important plank of what I'm calling exile economics, that we shouldn't, the idea that there's no point in collaborating, nations should just go their own way. And perhaps the third and most important is the third one there, striving for greater national self-sufficiency. What does that mean? It means that you don't need to import as much as you perhaps have been. Maybe you should produce more at home. Maybe you should consume more of what you produce. You should be more self-sufficient, more self-reliant. That's the third strand of what I'm calling exile economics. And now you might ask, so how is that different from some of the other buzzwords we've been hearing in recent years? Like deglobalization, this idea that the world is deglobalizing, becoming less globally interconnected economically. How does it relate to things like economic nationalism? The idea that you should look after your country first and not to be concerned about the rest of the world. How does it relate to these two? Well, this buzzword, geoeconomics. I don't know if any of you have heard that. It's like geopolitics, but in relation to economics. And it's this idea that you use economic tools to coerce other nations into doing what you want them to do. And we'll talk about someone who does that a lot. So look, it is related to those things. Exile economics is related to all of those concepts, but I think I use it to talk about something slightly different, or rather something a bit more broader than that, because exile economics, in terms of how people sell it, is not something that's destructive or coercive or just simply trying to turn the clock back, which is kind of the implication of deglobalization. Exile economics promises to build something better in the place of what we'd have, something that will make us feel, in the rhetoric of its advocates, that will make us more secure, that will make us more economically prosperous, and it will make us all better off. That's the promise of people who are pushing exile economics, and we'll talk more in the next half an hour or so about whether that's true or not, but that's how I am defining it. So who is pushing exile economics? Well, it wouldn't surprise you to see this man at the top of my slide deck, Donald Trump. You'll all no doubt remember 2nd of April, what he called liberation day for America in terms of trade. He held that big sandwich board, really, of tariffs that he was going to slap on all America's trading partners, from China to the EU, India, and so on down the list. And he actually spelled it out, in a way for me very, very, very clearly and very helpfully, because he said on that day, it's our declaration of economic independence. Now, remember the third strand of Exile economics, what I talked about, being more self-reliant, being self-sufficient. And that's what he's talking about there, being economically independent. So obviously, Donald Trump is the biggest champion of Exile economics and the new era that we have. But I think it's important to recognize that this isn't just about Trump. It's not just about Trump coming in back to the White House this year. What you see here is a measure done by this really useful organization called Global Trade Alert. And what they do is they monitor what every country is doing on trade in terms of restrictions, new restrictions on exports or imports, anything that impedes trade. And I think this is really important because what you see here is a very large increase that predates this year. So you can see it going up rapidly from about 500 new interventions globally that impede trade in about 2016, and then going up very rapidly to more than 2,500 in 2025. And that's obviously, there's going to be more by the end of the year. But a big, sharp increase. But the increase predated this year. So this has been going on, I would contend, this era of exile economics, from this perspective, for quite a long time. We've having more restrictions on trade from many countries for many years. And now, you can think back and you can imagine what those were. In the pandemic, you'll remember there was restrictions on the exports of masks from many countries and other personal protective equipment like that. There were, in the energy crisis in 2022, many countries stopped the export of agricultural products and food temporarily, but that would have all been captured in here. So what you're seeing is a real retreat from the principles of global free trade manifested in many governments, not just America, putting these measures on to restrict trade. Now let's talk about the second biggest economy, or the first biggest, depending on how you measure it, but certainly one of the biggest, China. Is China an advocate of exile economics? Because often it presents itself as the guardian of free trade now, where America's pulling back and China wants to keep global trade open. Well, up to a point. Up to a point. This is a quote from the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping in, you can see, 2018. So this is quite a few years ago. The starting point for the struggle of the Chinese nation is self-reliance, Zili Gengsheng. And what he's talking about there is quite similar to what Trump talks about, actually, in many ways, which is making China less dependent on imports from the rest of the world, more self-reliant, more self-sufficient, and he has implemented a whole suite of policies since he became premier in 2013. To that effect, whether it's agriculture or industrial production, he is trying to make China more self-reliant, just as Trump is trying to make America more self-reliant. So it's not just Trump, it's also China. Who else? Well, India. Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India. This was a speech he made in May 2020. The state of the world today teaches that a Atmanirbhar Bharat, which translates as self-reliant India, is the only path. And you'll be picking up the echoes in the rhetoric here already, no doubt. Talking about India, the world's most populous country, also not being as reliant on trade as it has been. So, what have we got? We've got America, we've got China, we've got India, all talking the same kind of language of increasing self-reliance and being less reliant on trade with other countries. So, what about the UK, you might ask? Well, let's look at what our Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, said. This was actually before she became Chancellor. It was in March 2024, before the election, but it was in this big set-piece speech where prominent economic figures and policymakers set out their economic philosophy. Some of you might remember she gave this thing called the Mays Lecture in March of 2024, where she talked about securonomics as what she put, is how she described it. So what was her description of that? Well, I've got the quote from the one element of it there. There must be red lines, things for which we should not rely on states whose interests conflict with our own. So, I think you can read into that an element of exile economics, certainly saying there are some things that we should not be reliant on others for, some element where trade, even if it's economically efficient, conflicts with our security objectives, bit of exile economics in there. But I think, in fairness to Rachel Reeves and the government, she also went on to stress, as you can see there, we want to make it easier to export and import. So for the UK, look, I think they've dipped their toe. The government has dipped its toe in exile economics. It's not plunged right in a way that America, China, and India have. But we're not immune to it. The government has not been immune to this big global movement in this new era. So we'll see how that turns out. But what I want to talk about in most of this talk is what does exile economics, this new era, mean for global supply and value chains? Now, I don't need to tell an audience like this what global supply chains are. You live it every day. It's your bread and butter. It's obviously firms sourcing goods and services from overseas, also in the UK, but I'm going to talk about the overseas element. But I want to focus a little bit more on this thing called global value chain, which is connected, but it's not exactly the same thing. What I'm talking about in terms of global value chains is the way that the value that's added in the final product is added in many, many different countries from the one it's sold into or the one it's finally produced in. Global value chains, where the value of the final product is added in multiple different countries. Let's put it in context, because I don't think this is really appreciated in the popular discourse in most people's minds. Most people think of global trade as being final products, the car you import, the TV you import, the iPhone you import, the things that go to customers. That's people's view of trade. But it's really important to recognize that, as this shows, 60% of global trade now consists of intermediate products. So what are those? Well, those are goods and services that businesses use as inputs to be able to produce the final products, which are sold to consumers. They are parts, they're widgets, they're raw materials, they are goods which make the other goods that you need, make the machines which you need to make the goods in the final country. All of those unsexy things which people wouldn't really understand because they don't understand what they're for, but they're so important. 60% of all the trade that goes on is those intermediate products. And that is a measure, a very good indicator of how embedded and important global value chains are. That is global value chain trade in one figure. And I want to show you what's been happening over time to it as well, because I think this is super important as well. You can see this is a measure of intermediate inputs as a share of global production. So imagine global manufacturing. That's the denominator here. And the numerator is the value of all those intermediate inputs. And what's astonishing about this is that despite that chart I showed you earlier about those restrictions on trade being brought in by all those countries over the past 10 years, actually global value chain trade has still been rising over that period. You can see it really took off in 2000. It kind of flatlined a bit after the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. But it's held its own. It's not declined. It's actually, and in recent years, it's gone up. Global value chains are big, and it looks like, well, from this, that they are not going anywhere. Now, we'll see what happens in the new era. But I think what this is showing you is that it's not easy to move into that new era. We are reliant on global value chains as a global economy. We are very reliant on that trade. And if you were to monkey around with this or try and crush that down to levels of, 1965, down to 6% from around 20% today, that's going to be incredibly disruptive for businesses around the world, and it's going to have a very big negative impact on people's standards of life. Quality of life and their wages and their incomes down the line. And that may be a reason why this new era may actually not last or may not be as extreme as some have been predicting, simply because we are so reliant on global trade. That's summed up in that picture. But that's the big picture. I want to delve down into a few global supply chains in a bit more detail here. And I'm going to talk about some of these. I could talk about many, many more, but I want to focus in on vaccines, medicines. I want to talk about semiconductors, so that's microchips and the crucial things which are used in everything from your TV to your iPhone to the AI data centers and everything else. I want to talk about food, global supply chains in food, global value chains in food, and I want to talk about steel. So let's get into vaccines first of all. So obviously, we all know, don't we, after the pandemic, how vital vaccines were in enabling us to unlock our economy, to restart our lives. We were all hanging on to the rollout of vaccines to enable us to return to normality. So we don't need to stress how important they are. But I think what we do need to stress is how much they are genuinely global products. They're produced by the planet, not by any individual country. So final vaccine production is concentrated in around 13 countries. You can see I've listed some of them there: America, China, India, Japan, Switzerland, the UK does some, France. But that's only the final product. If you look at the supply chain, this is a figure from the makers of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID vaccine, which I'm sure I certainly had that in 2021, I think. And many of you will have had it as well. It's one of the mRNA vaccines. And they say that was made with 280 different ingredients sourced from 19 different countries. 19 countries. And some estimates say that vaccines are even more reliant on different countries and different ingredients than that. This is another one here, another estimate that a typical vaccine plant uses 9,000 different materials sourced from 300 suppliers across 30 countries. It's really underscores how much these are global products. They're not the products of any single nation because they're drawing on these materials from right around the world. I want to try and illustrate this a bit more with this, which is a really useful resource from McKinsey's Global Institute, Global Trade Explorer. Go on the website and have a play around with it. It's interactive, really, really useful to get a sense of how global value chains work. So what you're looking at here is the trade in so-called biologics, which is the key ingredient that goes to making up a vaccine, the active ingredient in it, if you like. And the size of the discs represent different countries and how big an importer of these biologics they are. And what I want you to take away from that is really just how complex it is. Look at all those arrows. That shows you the trade. The bigger the arrow, the higher the value of the trade going between these countries. And you can see lots going to America, but lots going to Germany, going to Japan, to China. Look, there's lots of different countries involved, lots of big importers, and lots of trade going on. That is the complexity of global supply chains for biologics, as I said, the key ingredient for vaccines. Let's just focus in on the United States here to make this point. So this is their imports of biologics. You can see there it's about $72 billion worth of imports in 2023 from the rest of the world. It's coming from loads of countries. It's coming from Ireland, it's coming from Germany, it's coming from Belgium, coming from Japan. All those biologics going to the United States. And you might think, well, look, that shows you that the United States is really reliant on the rest of the world for biologics. And that's quite a dangerous position for the United States to be in. Maybe they should just try and produce all those biologics in America. But there's another side to this, which is shown by this, which is the US also exports many of those vaccines to the rest of the world, who are sending those biologics to America. So this is final trade in vaccines. So this is the final product. And you can see here, again, the circles illustrate how big an importer of these they are. Look at Ireland. Look how many are going to Ireland. Look how many are going to Belgium from the United States. And they will go on from Belgium to other places as well. But I think what I want you to take away from this is that, yes, the US is very reliant on raw ingredients for their vaccines, but the rest of the world is very reliant on the United States for the final vaccines. What we see in the global vaccine trade is a story of interdependence. It's not one country being dependent on another. It's everyone being dependent on everyone else. So that's vaccines. Let's talk about semiconductors, microchips. Now, again, the numbers are really amazing when you look at the supply chains. and the value chains. A single chip, as it says there, can cross international borders more than 70 times in the manufacturing process, which is a really astonishing statistic. And if you look at the raw materials that are going to make these come from all around the world. You know, the ultra-pure quartz that's needed to make the crucibles, which melt down the silicon, which makes the chips, has to be very, very high grade. That comes from America. And you look at silicon, which is produced in Japan, and neon gas from China, tungsten. There's a whole long list of vital raw materials, and they come from many, many different countries. Now, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the fact that we rely massively on Southeast Asia for the final production of these chips. Again, this is that McKinsey data set, and you can see here, this is export. These countries are ranked by their exports of the final computer chips. And you can see how big Taiwan is there. Taiwan is an absolute superpower when it comes to manufacturing chips and sending them to the rest of the world. The world is massively reliant on Taiwan, and also Southeast Asia and Asia more broadly. You can see how big Malaysia, South Korea, China, Japan, they are the world's manufacturing hub for semiconductors. And the rest of the world, Europe and America, not really at the races, as I'm sure many of you will have learned and know about. But again, it's a more complex story because you need equipment to manufacture those microchips. You don't just set up a factory and do it all yourself. The reality is it's an incredibly complex procedure, and you rely on very, very sophisticated manufacturing machines to make these ultra-sophisticated microchips. And this is what this diagram is showing you. So this is the trade of chip production machinery and components. And you can see clearly there that the picture has changed from the last one of reliance on Southeast Asia. And Europe and America are much more important in the production of these machines that make the microchips. And you can see Netherlands there. Why is the Netherlands so big? Well, have you heard of a company called ASML? Anyone heard of that? It's an offshoot of Philips, the old light bulb manufacturer, but it's far, far bigger than Philips now. It makes the photolithography machines, which make the most cutting-edge chips. If you ever want to go down a YouTube wormhole, look at photolithography, look at ASML. It's an amazing story. Basically, no one else in the world can make these machines, only the Netherlands. That's why the Netherlands is so important in this supply chain and why it's so big there. But also, look, the United States is big. So America complains about being reliant on other countries for microchips, but other countries are massively reliant on the United States for the machinery that creates the microchips. You can see those flows from the United States to China, to South Korea, to Japan, to Singapore, Malaysia, those flows from Europe to those countries as well to make the chips. What I would say, again, we're looking at a story of not dependence. We're looking at a story of interdependence when it comes to semiconductors, these crucial components which are at the heart of these trade disputes at the moment. So let's talk about food. I think Leanne, who was on earlier, will know about global food supply chains. But let's talk about how it's a story of interdependence there. But let's take a little bit of a detour. Let's talk about China and soybeans. Now, why? You can see Chinese consumption of soybeans there has been growing over recent decades. It's gone up from about 6 million tons to around 20 million tons in the most recent data, so it's been growing a lot. Why does China consume a lot of soybeans? Well, it's not for the population to eat. It's not for people. It's not for tofu and things like that. It's mainly for its herd of 450 million pigs. A lot of pigs in China. And that, of course, is feeding the Chinese population. They've become richer. China is consuming a lot more meat, and they need a lot of soybeans to feed the cattle. It goes into animal feed to produce the food for human consumption. So China, very reliant on soybeans for its meat production. But where are those soybeans coming from? Well, they're not actually, on the whole, coming from China. It has been growing, Chinese production, but the really big surge, as you can see from that red line, is from imports. China is importing huge volumes of soybeans, and it's those imported soybeans which are feeding its pig and cattle population, which is then feeding the Chinese population. So the natural next question, where are those soybeans coming from? Well, you can see here, China is the big red disc there, the biggest global importer of soybeans by far. And those arrows show you where they're coming from. You can see some from Canada, some from the United States, a large amount from the United States, not as much as Donald Trump would like, and he's very angry that China isn't buying as many soybeans as they used to from American farmers. But really, it's Argentina and Brazil that are the biggest supplier of soybeans to China at the moment. There's really, really thick lines. So look, what message can you take away? Well, on first inspection, you might say, well, look, China, the rest of the world has China over a barrel when it comes to agriculture. They rely on the rest of the world to provide them with the soybeans which they need to feed their population. So isn't this a classic story of dependence and vulnerability for China? And Xi Jinping has been saying we need to increase our domestic supply of soybeans so we're not so reliant on the rest of the world. The trouble is, China doesn't have enough arable land to grow all the soybeans that it needs to feed its own animal population. At least it can't do it without transferring land from the production of wheat and rice to soybeans instead. So if China wants to have, this is an amazing reality, and I talk about it more in the book, but if China wants to have the diet that it has to import soybeans. It has to import food. It can't do it all itself. That's a stark reality, and it's been, Chinese researchers have shown it, have demonstrated it. It's an amazing fact that they are doomed to import food, and China is doomed to interdependence when it comes to food. But there's another element of this, which I think I want to just briefly get into, which is that fertilizer trade, very, very important for food production. You can see it here. This is, just take away from this the fact that a lot of countries import and export a lot of fertilizer, and that fertilizer is vital for their agricultural production. They can't do it without it. And you can see here, let's just talk about Brazil for a moment. Brazil is, as we saw before, sending all those soybeans. It's incredibly good at producing soybeans. It sends them all to China, but Brazil is very reliant on fertilizers, phosphates, sulfates, potash, from all around the world to make its agriculture so productive, to enable it to be such a big exporter of agricultural produce. And you can see there, it's sucking them in from all these countries, United States, but also China. So a story of interdependence when it comes to food production, global interdependence, not dependence. Also the United States, very, very big agricultural producer, an agricultural superpower, but again, it relies itself on fertilizer to make its agricultural so productive. Some coming from Russia, Saudi, but look at the Canada one. A lot of the almost $10 billion worth of fertilizer that America imported in 2023 was coming from Canada. So maybe not such a great idea to slap tariffs on them, you might say, given your agricultural sector relies on them. So that's agriculture. I want to talk briefly about steel. Now, I'm sure some of you will know about the steel situation in this country, a lot of angst about it, and the global situation of overproduction. I want to focus in on the interdependency of the global steel supply chains, though, because I think this is very, very important. So you can see here steel exports by country. Perhaps no surprise, China is by far the biggest global steel exporter, exporting about 80 million tons in 2023, and then Japan second, South Korea, and then the UK way down at the bottom on about 3 million tons. So this will be kind of familiar to a lot of people. China is the elephant in the room in steel production and very much overproducing. I think that critique is very valid. But I want to focus on this, which is steel imports by country, which I think is less talked about, but nonetheless important. So you can see the countries, they're exporting, but they're also importing steel. That's interesting, isn't it? Let's just focus on Turkey, for instance, here. You could look at anyone, but Turkey. So it's exporting 11 million tons of steel in 2023, but importing 18 million tons. China, as well as exporting 80 million tons in 2023, imported 10 million tons. So why would they do that? They've got so much steel they're producing, and they can They can satisfy their own needs. Why would they be needing to import steel? Well, the answer is that every piece of steel is not fungible. It's not the same as everyone else. There are different grades of steel. There's different qualities of steel. You may need special steel for a specific manufacturing process. So again, look, you can say, well, let's just produce all the steel we need at home. But that's going to interfere a lot in global trade. Companies which are forced to only buy steel from their own country are not going to be able to do that importing, and that's going to have a negative impact on their ability to produce. Steel, even a commodity like steel, it's a story, as I've been harping on about in this, it's a story of interdependence, not dependence. Okay, let's get on to how economically damaging this new era could be. So this is an estimate from the International Monetary Fund a few years ago, and they said, well, what if there were two big blocks in the world? There was China and there was America. So Europe and the UK only traded with United States, didn't trade with China, and then countries like Russia and Iran and some other countries in Southeast Asia only traded with China, and then other big blocks like Brazil or India would sort of choose between. So this is a scenario of global economic fragmentation that the IMF was using here. Now, we don't know how it will pan out, but it's a plausible scenario for a very much a sort of a rapid descent into the world of exile economics that I've been describing. They said the damage from that would be roughly 7% of the global economy. So it would be 7% smaller than it otherwise would have been, ultimately, if the world was to fragment, global trading patterns were to fragment in that way. What I've done here is I've put that in current cash terms. So the global economy is roughly about $100 trillion. So lose 7% of that, you're losing about $7 trillion of global output, a very large number indeed. And just to put it in some context, if you add up the current value of France's GDP and Germany's GDP, you get to roughly about $7 trillion. So imagine losing the output of France and Germany from the global economy forever. I mean, it's huge. It's a very, very large amount of damage. And this is from the IMF, by the way. So I'm sure you all want to know, where does that leave the UK? There we are, highlighted in red, looking somewhat lonely in a big, wide world. Well, first of all, let's talk about how important global trade is for the United Kingdom. This is global trade. This is the world's trade, imports and exports added up, divided by global output. And you can see global trade, it's about just under 60%. So it was growing very strongly in the 1990s and 2000s, kind of flatlined since the global financial crisis in 2010. But it's still a considerable amount of global output is accounted for by trade. Here's where America fits in that. You can see it's much less important than for global trade. It's only about 25%, similar pattern, but just at a much lower level. China is interesting. China, going up to the global financial crisis, trade was about 60%. It's become less important for China. Now it's about 37%. So that's the two big economic superpowers. Where does Britain fit in? Well, here you can see it in red. And what this is showing you, UK trade as a share of UK output, UK GDP is about 64%, which is higher than the world, certainly higher than America, certainly higher than China. What this is showing you is that we in the UK are very reliant on trade. That's a fundamental takeaway from this chart, and something you should bear in mind at all times when we're talking about tariffs and trade wars and the new era of exile economics. And in terms of the UK impact, it all comes down to those global value chains. So roughly half of total UK production, this is from the Bank of England, comes from the sourcing and sales of those intermediate inputs. Remember those widgets and components and parts? It's very, very large share of the manufacturing sector in the UK. And this is, again, from Bank of England research, which I think is really fascinating. So if you look at just the face value of these different sectors here of the UK manufacturing sector, so you've got vehicles, basic metals, electric equipment. If you just look and say, well, how much are they reliant on foreign imports for their production, as a share of their production, you can see this is sort of 9% for vehicles, basic metals, 8.3%, plastics, 7.7%. So, pretty reliant on trade. The rest, they're reliant on UK supply chains. This is from the foreign supply chains. But that's only part of the picture. That's only the final component they're importing. But what if those those imports were reliant themselves on global trade? So think about a UK car manufacturer. It imports an engine, for instance, from Austria. So the value of that engine is the value of their foreign imports. This is just a stylized example. But what if that engine, which was manufactured in China, in Austria, relied on a Chinese cylinder to go into it? So that supplier has used a foreign importer. And what if that Chinese cylinder maker had relied on a Japanese piston maker as part of that cylinder? And so on, and so on. And if you think about the actual reliance on foreign trade of UK manufacturers, you get quite a starkly different picture, actually. Or at least it shows you that there is much more reliance on foreign manufacturing than, on foreign global supply chains than it looks on a face value look. So you can see in red here, this is the Bank of England estimates. If you looked through the supply chain and said, well, total reliance of these different sectors, and it goes up sharply, doesn't it? So let's just focus. I know there's some people in the room which are in the automotive sector. Let's look at vehicles. So what we're seeing here is that the face value of the vehicle manufacturing sector's reliance on foreign imports is about 9.3%. But if you include all of the components they're importing from other countries which themselves are reliant on global value chains, and you think about the entire picture, the reliance on foreign imports goes up by another 22 percentage points, and the total reliance, as you can see at the end of that bar, is about 31%. So just under a third of the value of the production of the UK vehicle sector is coming from foreign imports. That's really important to bear in mind. And that reliance means that we have a lot to lose, put it that way, from an era of exile economics. This is a different model, a set of modeling from the OECD. They had a different scenario, which everyone puts up tariffs on everyone else of 25% and spends another 1% of GDP on domestic subsidies. So different from what the IMF were modeling, but another, some would say a realistic or at least a plausible scenario for global economic fragmentation. And you can see what happens to the world in the black line there, 5.5% off global output, ultimately. So very, very big negative shock to the global economy. But look at the UK, because they broke it down by country, the OECD, in their modeling. 12.2%. We get hit in this scenario, according to their modeling, more than any other of the big economies, more than China, more than the US, more than anyone apart from Canada, who just pip us at 13%. So big, a lot to lose for the UK in that scenario. And why is this? Well, it's because we are so reliant on those global value chains, sort of pulling the threads together of what I've been talking about. We, more than most countries, rely on intermediate imports. We rely more than other countries on global value chains to produce what we produce and to underpin our economy. This is how the OECD puts it. The more a country relies on foreign inputs for production, larger the drop in GDP when you're shifting to that localized regime. And it says Canada and the UK, for example, highly integrated the motor vehicle and parts value chains, and where these activities account for important shares of economic activity. So what it's saying is we are very reliant on global trade. We have important sectors which are extremely reliant on foreign imports, and that's why we have such a considerable amount to lose from an era in which countries impose or make it harder to trade, whether it's finished goods or intermediate goods. So, coming towards the end now, and please, let me know your questions at the end, because we've got a roving mic and we'll come to them. But in summary, I would say exile economics, this era of downgrading multilateral collaboration, denying interdependence, and countries trying to be more self-sufficient. I think that we're in that new era, and those forces are rising. Now, it may fail, or it might be aborted because of the reality of those global value chains. It will just be too expensive for us or for the world to move in that direction, and there will be a backlash. We talk about a backlash against globalization. Maybe there will be a backlash against the backlash as people see the effects on their lives and say, no thanks, it's just too expensive and it's not delivering what it promised to deliver. But I think, third takeaway, it's going to be costly to attempt to get to that world. And sadly, a bit of a downbeat note, but I hope I've demonstrated that it's the reality. For the UK, it threatens to be especially painful. The UK is especially vulnerable in a world where countries are not trading as much with each other, where countries are trying to be self-sufficient. So I'm going to end there, but please, let me know your questions. Thank you very much. Right, has anyone got any questions? Oh, gentleman there. Oh, sorry, yes.
Just wondering if the vulnerability you talk about is worse because of Brexit. You used 3 examples of India, China. You didn't mention exile economics and Brexit.
No. As a BBC journalist, it's one of those tricky areas you can imagine. Look, I would just point to the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, the government's official forecaster. They laid it out very clearly, based on a reading of all the academic studies, that Brexit has made it harder for us to trade with our key trading partner in many, many ways. And I'm sure everyone in this room, or many people in this room, will have experienced that firsthand. That has already harmed our economy and will go on doing it. Whether it makes us more vulnerable in an era of trade barriers going up, yes, if the trade deal with the EU was to be, rewritten in a way that disfavoured the UK, obviously I think that would be the case. I don't think there's any sign that's going to happen. But no, so Brexit is part of the picture, undoubtedly. It's a drag on our productivity growth, according to most reasonable estimates, and will continue to be so. But I suppose probably more of the action is with Asia, more of the action is with America at the moment in terms of those trade barriers. So yes, it's part of the picture. It's by no means the whole story. And over there.
Hi, I was just wondering about the cost, especially around food. So if you look at, you'd mentioned there about America being an agricultural superpower, but around quality. So when does the cost and the quality outweigh each other? Do you think we're going too vastly towards cost and getting less food, I guess?
Yeah, well, this is similar to the Brexit question, isn't it? Where does the UK fit into global food supply chains? America wants to sell more to the UK and has done a deal that we will import more bioethanol, not for human consumption, but beef as well, American beef. And look, this is a very live issue. I'm not going to talk about whether it's right or wrong for the UK to be more open to American agriculture. That's a decision for government ministers, and it's a decision ultimately for consumers about the standards they care about. I think you make a very valid point, though, that it isn't just about cost, and never has been really. Globalization has always involved a degree of consumer choice. People are choosing to consume products from other countries, not because they're forced to, it's because they prefer them. People prefer clothes which are made in China because their quality is just as good and they're, 6 times cheaper than they would be if they were produced in other parts of the world. Food is a special case, I grant you that. People really care about that. But I would sort of try and move away from the idea that it's all about efficiency. People do care about things like animal welfare. People do care about things like quality as well. And that goes for agriculture and many other products. There's a gentleman there, I think. Yeah. I think got a mic coming to you.
My original question's already been asked, so I'll jump to early on. You made a point about Rachel Reeves' speech pre-election. Talk about exports, import-export. Do you think we've achieved that? We're actually getting better at that, making that more seamless?
Well, certainly the government would argue that it has. They would say that it's done a trade deal with the US and India, which the previous government failed to get across the line, and it's eased trade relations with the EU, and it says there are 3 big wins. I think the reality is it's a little bit more mixed than that. I think an objective view would say that what happened with the US was not a free trade deal, certainly not the kind that was talked about in the Brexit negotiations. It's really a sort of US tariff mitigation pact, if you like. So we'll get slightly lower tariffs than the rest of the world from America, which is not to say it's not a good thing to have, but it's really not the great liberalizing free trade deal, which was held up as something that we would be able to do post-Brexit. I mean, look, the India deal is significant, I think. It's fair to say. It's not maybe not as spectacular as some have presented it, but it's certainly true that it got over the line. And maybe that's a hopeful note, actually, on which to conclude, which is that I talk about in the book the 1930s analogy of when America last put really serious tariffs on the rest of the world. This was 1930. The Great Depression was just starting, and it worsened the Great Depression. And everyone put tariffs on everyone else. This was a real global trade breakdown. And I said, this is a warning from history. This has happened before, and we need to be wary of it happening again. That's what I write in the book. And I finished writing the book on the 10th of January this year, so before Donald Trump came in. But he made clear that he was going to put up huge trade barriers against the rest of the world. What I've been relatively encouraged by since I wrote the book and since he's come in is that although he's followed through to a large extent on what he promised in terms of putting up trade barriers and plunging America headfirst into the era of exile economics, is that other countries haven't followed suit. Of course, China has retaliated against America. Of course, Canada has retaliated against America. But other countries haven't. Some have tried to deepen their ties. The UK and India, in response to Trump's tariffs, have said, well, let's get our trade deal over the line. Let's find some other markets for our exporters. That's an encouraging sign that we're not going to repeat the catastrophe of the 1930s, where everyone stopped trading with everyone else. And I hope that I've sort of got through to you some of the stakes involved in that. So far, perhaps we can avoid the worst, but future is still to be written. Lots still to be determined about this new era. So thank you very much.